Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. And as always, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for tonight's program, The Sassoons, the Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire with Joseph Sassoon. This program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 Decade of Discovery theme, Yiddish Around the World. Before we get started, just note your audio and your video will be off. Sorry, I'm a little off this evening, everybody. Will be off throughout the program. You may submit questions at the question panel to the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short, and if you can refrain from comments, we can get through the questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce Joseph Sassoon. Joseph is the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and professors of History and Political Economy at Georgetown University. He holds the Al-Sabah Chair in Politics and Political Economy of the Arab World. He's also a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. In 2013, his book, Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party Inside an Authoritarian Regime, won the prestigious British Kuwait Prize for the best book on the Middle East. He's completed his PhD at St. Anthony College, Oxford, and Joseph has published extensively on Iraq and its economy and on the Middle East. His latest book is titled The Sassoons, the Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I really appreciate being hosted by the Yiddish Book Center.
We're thrilled to have you here. Wonderful book, and I'll leave it off to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I am going to share my screen so I can get to some. Okay, is it clear? Okay. So the Sassoons, a Baghdadi Jewish family, built a global trading enterprise by taking advantage of major historical developments during the 19th century. Their story is not just of an Arab Jewish family that settled in India, traded in China, and aspired to be British. It also really represents an extraordinary vista into the world in which they lived and prospered economically, politically, and socially. The 150-year globalization of which they were part of was all-encompassing. They traded with members of every religion and sect around the globe. They traveled extensively, not only for business, but to explore new countries. And they felt at home wherever they settled, whether in India or Britain or China, in spite of being a tiny minority everywhere, both in terms of religion and being foreigners in countries like India, China, and Japan. But the book is not only about their rise, but also about their decline, why it happened, how political and economic changes after the First World War adversely affected them, and finally, how realizing their aspiration to reach the upper echelons affected them and led to their disengagement from business and prevented them from adapting to the new economic and political order. Jews had been a continuous presence in Mesopotamia for some 2,500 years, since the forced exile in the 6th century BC, following the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians. There were thriving Jewish communities in all cities of what is now called Iraq, and there were likely more Jews there than anywhere else in the Arab East. This is Baghdad in the 19th century. According to a rabbi who visited Baghdad in 1824, there were about 6,000 Jewish families and 5 large synagogues in Baghdad. Another traveler a year later estimated 7,000 out of the total 50,000 being Jewish and noted the prominent role Jews played in the province. The community, which came to be known as Babylonian Jewry, possessed its own language called Baghdadi Jewish, a dialect of Arabic written in Hebrew letters. The family seems to have kept every scrap of paper. Their archives stretched for more than 100 years, and they engaged in copious correspondence, both for business and social matters. All the business correspondence at the time were in this language. Let me just explain. So this is a three language. It's Hebrew letters, but it's actually a Baghdadi Jewish dialect, which is in Arabic. So in order to understand or decode it, you need all three aspects. You need the Baghdadi Jewish dialect, you need to know Arabic, you need to know Hebrew, and of course, you need also sometimes to decode the difficult handwriting. This is a very typical correspondence of the time. There are no paragraphs. It starts with a very formal, ends very formal, but then it jumps from one subject to another. The English translation, I tried to put paragraph to make it easier to read. This is really the reason I decided to write the book, discovering tens and tens of thousands of those documents at the National Library in Jerusalem. That really what prompted me to realize there is an amazing story to be told. Interesting, this language later on, when they developed the business, became also almost a coded language. So messengers who were carrying messages of traders from one place to another, and remember the distance and the time it took from one place to another, a lot of them tended to sell the information to competitors. Guess what? They couldn't do it with the Sassoons because no one could decode that language unless they are from Baghdad. At some point towards the end of the 19th century, they begin to shift to write social events and social updates in English, but they kept the business side. So let me tell you a little bit about the family. There are really five main characters to take the center stage, but there are a lot of other characters, which I will mention very briefly. David Sassoon, the founder, his son Abdullah, they all had Baghdadi names that were anglicized as they moved to England. The second son, Elias, and this is one of the fascinating hidden stories in the book and in my discovery of the archives, that there was a woman that was part of the family, but she was the only CEO of a global trading firm at the end of the 19th century. There were a lot of matriarchs in America, in Europe, in Asia, but not a woman running a global trading business, and she ran it phenomenally successfully between 1895 and 1901. She got pushed because the men, unfortunately, in the family were angry at her success, believe it or not. Victor Sassoon, which is the last category of importance for the story, is the great-grandson of Elias. And I'm going to talk a tiny bit about it, but once David Sassoon died, he insisted in his will that his oldest son, Albert, become the new chairman. The second son, Elias, whom you see here, refused to accept this edict and argued that he's the one who opened China. He was bringing more business and more profits, and therefore a fair allocation will be 50-50. In one of the drafts, he was willing even 60-40. That didn't work. And from 1867, 3 years after the death of David, you have two competing companies, both carrying the name Sassoon, David Sassoon and Co., E.D. Sassoon and Co. So let me talk about the founder. The family, as I said, lived in Baghdad for a very long time, but in the early 19th century, conflicts with the governor, who was embezzling taxes, led David's father, who was kind of the equivalent, it's called in Ottoman, Saraf Bashi, but really what it meant is tax collector, or what we have today as Minister of Finance, in charge of the province of Baghdad. From time to time, governors changed. Some governors were good, some governors were corrupt. In 1828-29, a corrupt governor came to Baghdad and began pressuring merchant families, irrelevant of their religion, for money. The father realized that this is an endless and an unwinnable game. He took his son and they fled together Baghdad, leaving his siblings, or David's siblings, behind. I'm actually the descendant of one of those siblings. There really have been many erroneous versions like anti-Semitism and things like that. That is totally incorrect, because if there were anti-Semitism, why would you leave the rest of your family back in Baghdad? The other thing is, I checked this in the Ottoman Empire archives, and there is really no trace of that. One of the most fascinating things, they fled, they go to southern Iran, what is now called Iran, used to be called Persia, in a town called Bushir, which is a port city. And there they start meeting traders and sailors and hear about India and why India, Bombay. One of the things that kind was sold it to David is this notion that in India, they don't really care about any religion or sect. And as long as you're doing your own business, you're fine. And that really appealed to him a lot. Father has died, so David took his family and headed to Bombay. What is really interesting, neither father or son had any experience in trading. But David benefited from two intangible assets: extensive contacts in the Gulf and Persia as a result of the family involvement in many years, as I pointed out, in collecting taxes for the Sultan, and their good reputation among the merchant families in the region. Yet, in spite of all these preparations, it must have been daunting to take his young family into a city which was totally foreign and no family member resided, and far away from home in Baghdad. When David arrived in Bombay in the early 1830s, its inhabitants numbered no more than 200,000, but were very diverse: Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Armenians, Portuguese, and Jews. There was a Jewish connection with Bombay from the 16th century, as one of the eminent Portuguese traders residing in Bombay was a Jew. But there was no community until the second half of the 18th century, when 4 different migrations came to the city. The first is called Bnei Israel, the native Jew caste, and the second was Arab Jews from the Ottoman provinces of Baghdad, Basra, and Aleppo. The third were Cochin Jews from the Malabar coast, and the fourth were Persian-speaking Jews from Afghanistan, Bukhara, and Mashhad in Iran. David was by nature risk-averse and studied every possible difficulty. Family was of immense importance to him. His first wife died very young in Baghdad after bearing him 2 sons and 2 daughters. His second wife, who outlived him, gave birth to 6 sons and 4 daughters. Remember, those who survived. So in total, he had 14 children, and I call it the small army of the Sassoons that spread around the region. The sons were trained in business from a young age and later were sent off to Baghdad and the Gulf to meet other traders and gain experience and learn Arabic, which continued to be very important. David realized that the fate and success of his family had to be tied to the British Empire being the major superpower at the time. hence began a long connection serving British colonial, economic, and political interests in the different locations where the Sassoons branched out. As soon as the family arrived in Bombay, he began learning the Hindustani language, adding it to his fluency in Arabic, Hebrew, Turkish, and Persian. Remarkably, and in spite of his decision to tie his family's destiny with the British Empire and its interests, he never learned English. By the way, he got English tutors for all his children. Although he never set foot in Britain, nor he was granted British citizenship in 1853, and actually he couldn't sign it in English, so he signed it in Hebrew. One of the interesting things when you look at this is that he's also swearing allegiance to a company, which is really bizarre, but you have to remember that the East India Company was in control of India until 1857. David's cosmopolitan nature and ability to deal with people from all cultures and religions did not dent his strong adherence to Jewish traditions and rituals. Among his close friends in Bombay was John Wilson, a Scottish missionary who was an Orientalist scholar and educator. A few years before his death, David built a synagogue in the neighborhood where he resided in Bombay. Let me just show you. To the right, you see this beautiful blue building called Magen David Synagogue. The Indian government actually refurbished it and redid it about 9 years ago. It's a functioning synagogue. I was there just before COVID. Later on in the last few years of David's life, when he was not feeling well, he moved from Bombay to Pune. Pune is about 4-hour drive from Bombay, at least today, because the weather is better and it's less humid. And he built again another synagogue. This one is still there. It's a beautiful red brick building, and actually he is buried there. One of the things that we learned that what was important for merchant families who were expanding globally was not the religious beliefs of anyone, but what they really cared about. Can you trust your counterpart, given that they were trading from far and rarely met or spoke to other traders or agents? Later on in the 1870s, 80s, the family, together with the European families that they began to intermarry, such as the Rothschilds, the Gunzburgs, the Polyakovs, they put together an emblem of the family. As you can see, Emet ve'emunah in Hebrew, in Candida Constante, to put the emphasis on the issue of trust. There were religious symbols in this emblem, but also an emblem like the palm tree to remind them of their home country. Another tenet by which David lived and that was followed by his successor was the importance of charitable donation in the countries where they settled. And this is really, truly innovative. What the Sassoons did, starting with David Sassoon, is they put a tax, a charity tax on every transaction they did. It is really remarkable. The vast majorities of companies and families then and now, if they have a good year, they give X. If they have a bad year, maybe they don't give anything or half an X. That was different among the Sassoons. So when you look at their ledger books, you see, for example, purchase of a chest of tea, cost, transport, cost, maritime insurance, cost, and then always, the final line was a charity, tzedakah, mitzvah. Either they called it tzedakah or mitzvah, 1/4%. 0.25%. It might not seem quite a lot, but if you're doing hundreds and hundreds of trades, by the end of the year, you have a very large amount to donate, and hence you have these synagogues, and I will talk about they ended up local Jewish communities benefited from this, as did the poor and young cities in cities such as Bombay. The fact that the governor of Bombay from 1834 to 1838 was Sir Robert Grant, who lobbied in the British Parliament for the repeal of quote unquote civil disabilities affecting British-born subjects, end of quote, meant that the city was exceptionally welcoming to Jewish traders. The Sassoons felt they were a part of Bombay and of India at large. They contributed to building hospitals and schools, many of which still bear their name. If you go today to Mumbai, in the heart of Mumbai, there is the Sassoon Library. In Pune, there is the Sassoon Hospital, and other named places in India and China. They were active in the local currencies and realized that their new home afforded them safety and security. They purchased grand houses in Bombay, and similar to the English who were there, had a beautiful house in the hill station. Basically, the merchant families and the British officials, there were three movements every year. It's Bombay, then a season in Pune, and then in the mountains. I went and visited all those places. The place actually in the mountains is still there. It's a stunning area. Let me shift to business and tell you a little bit. Two commodities changed the city financially and led to the rise of new global merchants: cotton and opium. Though David Sassoon was not involved in those commodities initially, he monitored closely the trading scene in Bombay. His name is not mentioned in the archives or any local newspaper throughout the 1830s and most of the 1840s. David Sassoon's rise to be among the top businessmen of Bombay was slow and gradual. There was not a one event or trade that changed the picture radically. He just kept developing a network of traders and trustworthy counterparts and learning where the opportunities lie. He would spend days by the cotton exchange, talking to traders, agents, and scrutinizing the international news carefully. He was also fortunate in the sense that there were many entrepreneurs and firms, both local and foreign, from whom he could learn the ins and outs of trade and negotiations. And as I mentioned, in 1843, Elias David Sassoon sent his second son to explore the possibility of expanding into China. And after spending time in Canton, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, Elias reported back on the tremendous opportunities he had found. This coincided with the end of the First Opium War, which legalized opium and the opening of Shanghai to foreigners. In 1850, Elias settled in Shanghai and began reporting daily to his father in Bombay. By the 1850s, opium became an integral part of the family trading business after its total legalization. The sons of David Sassoon branched out to different cities: Singapore, Rangoon, Nagasaki, Kobe. Apart from opium and cotton, the other main commodities were tea, silk, indigo, rice, and pearls. The Sassoons were very cautious before embarking on trading in a new commodity. They researched the subject thoroughly and analyzed the risk and rewards. Interestingly, the Sassoons never engaged in money lending. They invested in banks around the world, sat on its board of directors to gain information and credit if needed. Let me just show you This is really the picture of expansion by the early 1860s. Remember, we're talking about 30 years after arrival with no experience and no capital. Notice that the vast majority of the places are port cities. Three red big stars, these are the major hubs. The first hub was Bombay, followed by the second hub, Shanghai, and the final hub by the 1880 in London. The family was fortunate to have other major factors working in its favor. Global commodity prices began to boom in the second part of the 19th century as industrialization and economic growth were taking place in the major economics of the world. Another factor was the British ideology at the time, emphasizing free trade, which guided the government policies worldwide and facilitated the operation of global trading families such as the Sassoon. From 1864, the impact of the telegraph radically affected global trade as branches began communicating efficiently the prices of commodity and major news items. And lastly, the transport and the development of transport, both within and outside India, led to a reduction in the cost of trade. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 really changed the dynamics of trading and cutting, for example, from Hong Kong to Shanghai by 10 days of ship travel. And when you're talking about merchandise, that is really quite a lot to come. David Sassoon probably did not suspect that after his death, the extensive family business would be divided and that two firms, as I mentioned, carrying the name would compete head to head. Although the decade 1858-68 epitomized the rise and expansion of the dynasty, other major events during the time created permanent rifts within the family. And in the book, I talk about those rifts and clashes between the brothers. In fact, the oldest brother, Albert, and Elias never exchanged a word until until their death. It's interesting, they competed so much. On one way, they hurt each other, but on another level, they became far more competitive, each one pushing into new areas and new regions. I want to focus on one important aspect, and that is what really they aspire to be in addition to building an empire. As refugees from Baghdad who left behind them a glorious past, David Sassoon and his family wanted to be first accepted in India and then later on in England. Their striving to be English and their investment in time and energy, not only to be English, but to be part and parcel of the upper class and close to the royal family, was for all practical purposes crowned with success. Paradoxically, on many levels, the Sassoons, I argue, were better received in England in spite of the rigid class system and, of course, the prevalent anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century. There are a number of plausible explanations. One, they arrived at a time when what was called the Manchester School of Liberalism and Laissez-faire was at its height, advocating free trade that would bring prosperity and equality. And it's called for accepting talent irrelevant of its origin. The 19th century liberalism movement called inter alia for individual dignity, open markets, and limited government. As the Prince of Wales, Prince Albert Edward, became the leader of this movement, most of the aristocracy accepted that notion and thus non-English elements became prominent in this attempt to build a new society. The relationship between the Prince of Wales and the Sassoon is absolutely fascinating. It commenced during a visit that he did to Bombay, and as in their typical manner, they hosted him lavishly, and that relationship continued where more and more members of the family headed to England. A second explanation that social ranking was more important than the color of skin in contemplating the privileges of individual in Britain long after it has been generally supposed they ceased to matter. The first major change was when the oldest son, Abdullah, decided to move to London, as it was becoming more critical to be in the financial capital of the world. In addition to building close relationship with British officials in India, Abdullah began to pave the way to move to London, as I said, by hosting any British dignitary visiting India. In 1872, Abdullah fulfilled one of his life's great ambitions. Queen Victoria granted him a knighthood, after which he became known as Sir Albert. This was a momentous occasion for a family who had left Baghdad only 40 years earlier and started a new life in India. In 1874, Sir Albert took up residency in England, but even before that, a new honor was bestowed on him. London's position in the world of trade was enhanced with the advance of telegraphic communications, particularly underwater cables, that caused a revolution in global trade. The city of London became the center of global trade and capitalism, and it presented him with the freedom of the city at a large gathering at the Guildhall. This was truly a historic occasion. In the presentation, the brochure stated, "This is the first time," and I'm quoting, "this is the first time an East Indian merchant has been admitted to the honor, highly prized by its possessor and much coveted by the aspirants to city fame. It is the first time that the freedom of city of London has been presented to a Jew." Think about it. 40 years from leaving Baghdad, he is now a sir and being presented with this honor. Climbing the social ladder was done through a number of means. Marriages was one such tactic. Not different from other communities, members of these large clans forged marriage alliances, and these alliances shaped their economic future. Among the Jewish marriages that were vital for these alliances were marriages that I mentioned with the Rothschild, Perugia from Trieste, the Günzburg from Paris and St. Petersburg, and the Polyakovs from Moscow. They were all European Jewish families with wealth and political connections. But marriages sometimes led to rift when they were out of faith, and many men and women were cut off by their family as a punishment. So the changes were dramatic. And I think to show you how things have moved. So Victor Sassoon moved from India to Shanghai in the 1920s. He built the first skyscraper in Shanghai. It is still existing, the one to the right with the color at night. It's on the Bund, which is the main street of Shanghai. If you go today to Shanghai, it's a hotel, the Fairmont Peace Hotel, a 5-star hotel, but actually outside it says in a big plaque that this is the Sassoon building, and inside there is even a small Jewish museum about the Sassoon. That really was kind of the last thing. The business was successful, tripled his fortune because Shanghai was becoming such a hub. Real estates were going up, but of course, unexpectedly in 1937, the Japanese invaded Shanghai. That really augured the beginning of the end of that side of the family. And of course, once Pearl Harbor happens, Shanghai, Hong Kong are occupied and to a large extent destroyed. And then even when the war ended, there began a civil war between the nationalists and the communists in China. And the final blow to all this business was the nationalization of all the Sassoon assets, about 14 major buildings. So, and this is another one. It just shows you he was hobnobbing with, in Hollywood, Marlene Dietrich was one of those rumored to be his girlfriend, time with Charlie Chaplin. Many of also these luminaries went and visited him in Shanghai in the 1930s when it was called Paris of the East. This also tells you this picture about life. Now they have to have grand houses in London, in the country, and of course, estates for hunting and shooting and horse racing. And that to me really truly symbolizes the transfer from the first generation to the third and fourth generation. Two more minutes. The Sassoons got what they wanted. They became very English, ascended the social ladder, developed close relationship with royalty, elected to parliament, received titles, and on the whole were accepted by British aristocracy. There were two consequences. One, from a social religious point of view, and the other was business related. This assimilation was to such an extent that they played less active role as time went by in the affairs of their co-religionists, though many continued to support Jewish charity. But more importantly, signs were popping up indicating their real wish not to be associated with the Orient. Stories circulated that there were members who wished the family's emblem not to have the Hebrew words emet ve'emunah. The Sassoons' decline began in the late 19th century, and I argue for David Sassoon and co. when they ousted Flora Sassoon from her job and gathered momentum on the other side in 1937. The demise of the family's business is not just a social phenomenon. It is the story of one of the first globalized firms that suffered the consequences of rejecting modernization and the changing time. And here lies a big paradox. The rise of the Sassoons in the mid-19th century came from their ability to adapt to major political and technological changes, but interestingly, it was their failure to do so towards World War I that brought about their decline, as they could not properly assess the political, economic, and social changes that were sweeping Asia and the world at large. Thank you, and I will stop sharing and come back to you.
Thank you, Joseph. An amazing, amazing story. Several questions. I'll start with, what businesses are the Sassoons involved with in today's world economy, if any?
None. It's really came to a natural end. Victor Sassoon died in 1961, and there was not a lot left in the business, and there was really nothing of business.
Can you speak about how Sassoon Hospital in Pune came to be? It's interesting. I got an email earlier, just by the way, from somebody who thanked the family who has benefited from all of these philanthropic enterprises. Or,
I mean, one of the things that they really did, and so, you know, like any philanthropy, it has what I call a dotted line to other benefits. So they built schools for girls, then for boys, then they built hospitals, then they built synagogues, they purchased cemeteries. They used it in an interesting way as a tool for marketing when they went back to Baghdad to hire young, dynamic people, ideally with knowledge, obviously, of the language, but also as accountants. And the way they sold it to them, look, if you bring your family, we're taking care of you. We have schools, we have hospitals, we have synagogues, and we even have a cemetery. And that, it seems to have worked. When David Sassoon moved to Pune, and I guess because of his health, he initiated building it. His son, Abdullah, the oldest son, continued it. It's a huge, huge campus. It's today actually combined with the medical school in Pune. Technically, it's called the General Hospital, but ask anyone where you're studying or where you visited, and they will all tell you it's Sassoon Hospital that is stuck. And that's how it's known in Pune, which is, I think, has population of about 6 million people.
Were all branches run by family members?
Yes, definitely all the major ones. I mean, not only some places were just by agents. That really two things have not changed from at the time: information and networks. Information, how do you get it? Is by spreading your network. It's information about the markets, information about what's happening politically. It's information about what the competitors are doing. But the answer is yes. A lot of times also they would send a member of a family to a branch. Once it get established, they would send someone else for senior. As more and more of them moved to London, it was really harder to send people to, these. Remember also some of them that, like Elias, was very religious and kept kosher. So you can imagine arriving in China at the age of 22, 23, not knowing the language, not knowing anyone, and you needed to adhere to the kosher rules. It took its toll.
Right. How many of the descendants are still Jewish today? It's a hard question, probably.
Hard question. I mean, there must be hundreds. One of the pleasures of doing this book is all kind of Sassoons popping up in America, in Europe, in Israel. Actually, the Hebrew edition of the book is coming out in June. Some more than others. It's really difficult. I mean, the people who made the connection and made the effort sees themselves as Jewish.
Can you expand on their role in Shanghai during World War II?
Yeah. So one thing that I talk about in the book, and sometimes people don't realize, Shanghai really was the only city left in the world that was open to Jews. There was no visa needed. So the question is, can you get there? And a lot of people managed, something like 30,000 from Germany, from Austria, who could not get visas anywhere else in the world. Once they got to Shanghai, they were accepted. And I think there is, I say it in the book, there is a debt that people owe to Shanghai for opening, in spite of the difficult conditions that prevailed in 1940-41. Victor Sassoon, as being one of the richest people in town, definitely contributed in two ways. One, money just by helping with food and shelter. But two, he came up with this idea that there were a lot of young people and they need to learn some kind of profession. There are people who tell amazing stories. Actually, 3-4 years ago, I attended a conference at Chicago University, and you might recall that the Secretary of Treasury under Jimmy Carter was Blumenthal. He was a refugee in Shanghai from age 7 to 10. So he was recounting about his memories of that period, which is absolutely phenomenal.
Related, someone's asking, how was the Sassoon family involved in the opening of the Shanghai ghetto in World War II?
In the ghetto. Well,
Yeah.
as the city was really crumbling on many levels. You have the Japanese breathing down the neck of all people. Ghettos that started opening, there were not many. They were really in a very, very bad condition, some of these ghettos.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the Chinese government has protected it now, because some of it, like 10, 15 years ago, were really collapsing. So it's now historical and cannot be demolished. It is in a good area, actually, of what is now Shanghai. But it was really tough. And there are some very good books describing life in these ghettos. They were not pleasant, but at least compared to other ghettos, they were safer from a physical point of view.
Several people are asking various related questions about the codex.
Well, well, first of all, it's not in the family, I wish, but so one of the fascinating things is the flora that the woman that you saw, the global CEO, she had 3 children. One of the children was obsessed of collecting Hebraica. And because they traveled, he traveled really all around with a lot of money, I'm guessing, buying Bibles, Torah scrolls, but also other old manuscripts. In fact, in 1930, there was a report that he was the most important Hebraica collector in the world at the time. A lot of these things were then, I saw that they sold it at a much cheaper price in the 70s. If people recall, or I think you can Google, you can go to last Christmas, there was at Sotheby's a Sassoon auction of all items from the Sassoon. And some of these things are really amazing. There was a Torah scroll from Yemen, again, 12th, 13th century. I'm guessing a museum bought it for $1 million. I mean, so beautiful books, all kind of jewelry that is coming up. But I guess when you have that kind of wealth at the right time, you collected a lot of these things.
What was the relationship with the Kadoorie family?
The family relationship with the Kadoorie. So one of the things that I mentioned, they went to Baghdad to hire talented young people and bring them to the East, to Bombay, to Shanghai, to Hong Kong. Of course, the more success they had, and the more their name became well known, you see letters from people in places like Baghdad writing to them and says, hey, I am A, B, like almost their resume. Can you hire me? Kadoorie was one of them. He was not the only one. Came in, worked for a number of years for the Sassoons, established themselves, and then they spun off and they became very, very successful. There is another guy called Hardoon, who actually at some point was rumored to be the wealthiest person in the whole of Asia. He moved to China, married a Chinese woman, and became very involved in China. But Kadoories and others spun off and became also very successful.
We have someone in the audience who's in Japan and is asking the status of the Sassoon house in Kobe.
Yes, it's still there. I can tell you, as of at least 5 years ago, it's not open to the public, but if you call in advance, they will open it. I saw that actually they rent it for weddings and other festivities. It's in a beautiful area, as I'm sure you noticed.
Several questions, so I'll just ask you sort of a general one,
Sure.
related to opium. Did the family grapple with the ill effects of opium on the masses? Was it a moral issue for them?
It's a very good question. I grappled with it in the book. I did not mince my words. But I had to say you need to put also a little bit of a historical hat. And let me just explain what I mean. One, as I said, it was legal. It was the most important commodity traded in the world at the time. If you look at financial newspaper from that period, it's quoted daily on a regular basis, notes dissimilar from gold or silver. Third, which is really, I didn't know that when I began my research. Until 1907, you can go to any pharmacy in New York or London and Paris and tell the pharmacist that you have a headache or indigestion, and you will be prescribed a little bit of opium. Last but not least, when there was pressure on the British government to stop the trade, they created a commission of inquiry that collected huge amount. They interviewed 20,000 people. This is over 5 years. They published 2,500 pages, including many medical experts. Their final conclusion, this is all exaggerated, the harmful effect of the opium in a nutshell. And they kept going back that if you ban opium, you should ban alcohol. I don't have to tell you the reaction of British parliamentarians when they heard they cannot drink whiskey. But I am not trying to justify, I'm just trying to put it in the context of 1850, 1860, and not the 2023.
Was there any specific desire to intermarry with Ashkenazi Jews? Did such intermarriage face any obstacles?
Not really. I mean, the first generation absolutely did not, and the second generation absolutely did not marry, but then there were marriages. I mean, their marriage, and I called it alliances. You really see it within, whether you look at the Rothschild, at any other families. This was normal.
Mm-hmm.
What's in it for me, what's in it for you. Some of these relationship and marriages were super successful, such as the Eileen Rothschild with the son of Albert. Others, like the one on Polyakov, was less a happy marriage. By the fourth generation, I would say, by the third generation, no one was marrying from Baghdad. They were either marrying Ashkenazi women or more and more non-Jewish women or men, for that matter, because in fact, another woman who was super successful was Rachel Beer Sassoon, who again married out of the faith. Interesting enough, in 1916, when women in Britain could not vote, she became the editor of the national news, the biggest national newspaper at the time, which was incredible. But that changed, and so by fourth generation, you see many that were married out of faith.
Question, which branch are you related to?
So as I mentioned, David, when he left, his siblings, brother, sister, stayed behind. I'm the descendant of one of those siblings. I guess, I don't know what cousin that makes me.
And I'm going to give you this last question, which is, do you think that this is a unique Jewish family story?
I think to a large extent, yes, given where they were from and given the circumstances. We have really been accustomed to reading a lot of European Jewish history that were very successful. I think this is a fascinating. I think it's also very relevant to our day-to-day, the fact that they were refugees, that they were immigrant, about changing identity, about success, about philanthropy, and about gender, and the role of gender that was fought by the men in who were angry at her success. So there are a lot of unique aspects to the story that I don't think many other families have.
Joseph, I want to thank you for a wonderful book, a wonderful presentation, and telling the story. Again, for those of you in the audience tonight, the Sassoons, the Great Global Merchants, and the Making of an Empire. And it is available at bookstores everywhere. So thank you again. We look forward to your next work and hope to see you at the Yiddish Book Center sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And again, thank you to the Yiddish Book Center. Much appreciated. And thank you for everyone who attended this evening.
And there are lots of them strewn about the world, I will tell you. It's a huge audience. We would have had to have done 8 performances at the center to accommodate this. So I'd also like to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, who does everything to make all of this magically happen. Tonight's program is part of an ongoing series of programs brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. Please join us on Thursday, March 2nd at 7 p.m. for the global reach of the Yiddish theater, the Vilna Troupe, God of Vengeance, and Yiddish performance the world over with Karen O'Brien and Deborah Kaplan. Again, March 2nd at 7 p.m. To see the full schedule of events and to register for our programs, to learn about what's in store for Yidstock 2023, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Before I let you go, I'd like to thank all of our members whose ongoing support makes all of our work possible. If you would like to help support, become a member, what have you, you can learn more and join at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us this evening, and we look forward to welcoming you back on March 2nd. Take care.